I'm Vaknine, and I, believe it or not, from looking at me now, spent most of my life, the majority of my life, being some variation of disabled. So I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis a month before my second birthday. It was actually known as juvenile idiopathic arthritis at the time, idiopathic meaning no defined cause. And I've since come to learn that absolutely everything has a defined cause. And it might be a little bit more nuanced, multifaceted than that, perhaps not exactly a defined cause, but nothing ever happens in a state of isolation. It's a cumulative process, but everything has a cause. Illness doesn't just fall out of the air and present itself in a 2-year-old child for no reason. Now, we were put under the care of a top pediatric rheumatologist, not because we sought her out, but we happened to live quite near to the clinic that she held, the NHS clinic she held. This was 1986, and the only treatment available at the time was steroids in very, very high doses. That was what they were suggesting was the way forward to treat juvenile arthritis, despite the age of the child. So this was the treatment of choice. And my parents had no education in holistic healing, no knowledge of natural health, really no kind of experience in healthcare at all, because thankfully for them, they'd never been ill, so they'd never had to. But my mum was always very spiritual and had this access to her intuition. And she was being given this very bleak prognosis by these authoritative figures who were telling her that this was the way forward and this is what you need to do. And she just had this gut feeling, just this inner knowing that this did not feel right. And she had nothing to back it up. She'd never read anything. There was no internet. There was nothing to tell her that she was right. But she just knew that she couldn't put this stuff into her 2-year-old. So she took this to the rheumatologist and told her how she felt. And she was met with the words, "bad mother." And if you don't do this, then your child is going to end up with joint deformities and perhaps later joint replacements, joint damage, all these very scary terms. And somehow, she still stayed strong in her resolve, and she took herself to the library, where she emerged a few days later, having decided upon homeopathy as being the treatment of choice for us. And there were many other signs that were kind of put in our way at the time to show us that that really was the treatment of choice. Again, she went back to the rheumatologist, and she was told not to waste your money on this voodoo, Mrs. Vaknine. Once again, she remained firm in her resolve and made a decision based on this gut feeling that allopathic medicine wouldn't be our route. My parents are here today, by the way. So that was the route we would take. And my parents gathered whatever money they could, and there wasn't a huge amount of it, and took me to see a homeopathic dietitian, which was very fringe at the time. It was very alternative. Right? And he was suggesting very fringe things, like not eating gluten or dairy and no acidic foods. And this was really hard at the time because there weren't a bunch of health food shops on every corner. We didn't have access to loads of substitutes like we do today. We didn't know that you could make spaghetti out of courgettes or milk out of almonds. We just kind of had goat's milk, and I didn't really want that. And I'd gone off food anyway, probably as a way of my body learning, having that innate intuition of knowing how to process this disease without having the metabolism involved too much. Now, a year after the arthritis diagnosis, I was also diagnosed with something called uveitis, which is inflammation of the iris in the eye. And although my parents had decided to go with a different route for the arthritis, we were told that with the uveitis, it was really difficult to see what was going on in the eye. So when I was having a flare-up with my joints, my parents could see that. They could see my joints were swollen. They didn't need tests to show them what my inflammatory markers were. They could see if I was swollen or not. But with the eye, you could only see into it when we were at the ophthalmologist, looking at it with the slit lamp machine. And the uveitis was associated with the arthritis. Many children who are diagnosed with arthritis before the age of 5, and especially girls, are also diagnosed with uveitis. So the treatment for that was steroid eye drops, which my parents did decide to go for because they just felt too scared to kind of mess around with the eye. A few years later, a homeopathic clinic thankfully opened up in the town where we lived in. So I started being treated there. And again, my parents kind of just used everything they could to put into being able to get me treated and having treatments there. And at the time, it was, even then, even in the 80s, it was like £40 a session, which was a lot of money. But they did this. And that was kind of how we went about my childhood. And so my childhood was filled with many happy memories, and it was a normal childhood in some ways, and in other ways it was also really traumatic. And I didn't really have, none of us had that terminology of trauma at the time, or emotional repression. And it was really difficult because there were really traumatic things happening. I might not have been taking the oral steroids, but if things got really bad, which sometimes they did, I would have my knees drained and have them injected with localized steroid. And there were all these other things that later I came to learn is actually trauma for a child. You know, having your knees drained without any sedation is trauma. And going into hospital for a week to have your eye injected is trauma. And spending your days out in a hospital waiting room with an egg and cress sandwich and a packet of salt and shake is trauma. And again, we never really had the terminology for this or the understanding of it. And my parents did the best they could to try and understand me, but I was very difficult. And I was labeled as difficult, highly strung, intense. No one really understood what was going on in this overwrought mind of mine. Everything affected me so badly. Other people's energy I took on, and I didn't understand that was what I was doing. And I understand it now, and now I kind of use it to my benefit. I understand energy, but at the time, it was just very, very difficult. It felt like life was very overwhelming for me all the time. And the other difficulty was obviously I was different. I was other than. So in school, next to my peers, I was a little bit different. So homeopathy was working in some ways. It wasn't curing me. And I'll get to why a bit later. And so I was the child with arthritis. And next to my school friends, I felt different. I had to sit on a chair in assemblies when my friends were sitting on the floor. And I had to wear these big fluffy boots to keep my ankles supported and warm when my friends got to wear, lovely black patent shoes. And, I couldn't go to the soft play parties and the roller skating parties and the rest of it. And that was kind of how it went. But there was also something else going on at the same time. And we noticed when I was next to other children with arthritis, so I went to a group hydrotherapy class every week throughout my childhood and well into my 20s with the same people. And my mum started noticing differences between me and them. So firstly, and the most important thing for me, was that I looked normal and I was growing normally. So the homeopathy hadn't cured me, and that again comes down to that thing of nothing in isolation, right? Nothing works in isolation, and we didn't have the knowledge or the resources to know all the other stuff we should have been doing alongside. That came later. And so it wasn't curing me, but it was really building my immune system. I had a strong immune system when all these other children were coming down with every cold and flu and everything going around, and all my bodily processes were working normally, which is really unusual for a child with an autoimmune disease because the immune system is constantly attacking itself. So this was a real positive. And we just noticed how different these other children looked. So obviously they all had really puffy faces from the steroids. And as time went on, we noticed other things. So they weren't growing, but also their limbs didn't seem to be growing properly. So their arms looked shorter than they should be. They were having one leg noticeably longer than the other. In time, they started getting joint deformities, joint damage, needing joint replacements. Hold on a second. Weren't these all the sorts of things that were supposed to happen to me because of my really bad mother for not treating me with steroids? And so the longer it went on, the more it confirmed what we were doing, that we were doing the right thing. And as time went on, more and more, we saw even more things. The girls weren't getting their periods, etc., etc. So, essentially, it was a happy childhood, marred on the side with trauma. But we knew that we were doing the right thing. So this whole looking normal thing came into play when I went to secondary school. Because when I got to secondary school, thankfully, the arthritis had calmed down a bit. And the doctors kept saying, well, maybe it's burnt itself out, because this is something they said a lot during my childhood. It could burn itself out by adolescence, and this was like a term that was held onto by my family, like a family heirloom. It will burn itself out. It wasn't really burning itself out because I was having maybe a flare-up a year, so it was kind of still there. But it was enough that I didn't have to show anyone that it was there. So at school, very few people actually knew that I had arthritis. And so my main objective during my high school years was to be normal, was to fit in, to be accepted, to be recognized, to be validated. I spent my whole 5 years at secondary school trying to achieve this. And I achieved it. I left school popular. Amazing. Did I feel validated? Did I feel any happier? Did I feel any better? No, because I'd spent the whole time trying so hard to make myself fit in that I never actually cultivated any real friendships. It was all about climbing the social ladder, trying to get this validation that I was seeking so desperately externally, because I wasn't getting that from within, because I simply did not understand myself or understand how this illness had caused so much trauma. And this is something we're missing with chronic illness. For anyone here who's suffering from chronic illness, you'll know that. It's very rare for other people who are just going about their life without illness to understand that there is so much more going on inside, how much chronic illness actually affects you mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It breaks you down. And if you've been a child with a chronic illness, in a time where there wasn't access to that level of information, that's very, very difficult. So I had discovered drama, and I left school to go to drama school. Because acting, I could be famous. That would give me the validation I want, right? If I was famous, then I'd be recognized. So that's what I was aiming for. And I went to performing arts school, and towards the end of my first year of performing arts school, as if someone had come in one night when I was sleeping and filled them up with helium, my knees just swelled up again, filled with fluid. The arthritis was back, apparently. And we were about to start auditioning for our end-of-year show, which I had decided that I was going to go for the lead role in. Turns out that wasn't going to happen, so I went back to my rheumatologist. Rheumatologist I'd been with since I was 4, when I moved on from the original one at 4 years old, and she said to me, well, yeah, your knees really are very swollen, we need to drain them. There's no way of getting rid of this fluid if we don't drain them, so we need to do that. So I had to have them drained once again without any sedation. And by the time I was well enough to go back to college and practice or rehearse for this audition for this piece that I wanted, the role I wanted to get in the play, I did myself so much damage auditioning for it that it never happened, and I was just basically in the chorus line. And so I went back to the rheumatologist, and she kept saying that, this is getting worse and worse, and you need to think about what you're going to do. But I also went to the ophthalmologist, and it turned out that the uveitis was also flaring really badly. But it wasn't just flaring. The reason that I couldn't see very well was because I now had cataracts. I didn't have one cataract. I had cataract growing over cataract growing over cataract, which it turns out was a result of the steroid eye drops I'd been on since I was 3. And she said to me that we really need to operate to get these cataracts out, because they're pushing against the optic nerve, which is pushing the pressure down. And the pressure was something like 2 at the time, which is really dangerous. The pressure should be between 14 and 17, somewhere in that range. She said, we need to get the inflammation down so we can operate. We can't operate while the eye is this active. So it's really important we get the inflammation down. So you need to take this drug. So I said, oh, give it to me, yeah. I mean, what has this homeopathy done for me all my life? Clearly nothing. Look at me now. So this was a chemo-based drug that they'd offered to my mum to put me on when I was 9, when they were trialing it. They wanted me to be a guinea pig for it. And my mum had said, absolutely not. But I was 18 now. I was an adult. I was going to make my own decision. Because what had all this other stuff done? Look where I was at. So I decided to go ahead with this drug. It was a chemo drug that they give you alongside folic acid. And within 3 months of taking the drug, I was really, really sick. I could barely function most days. I felt really unwell all the time. I was really nauseous. My bowels weren't working properly. Everything felt like it had slowed down. My skin didn't look right. I had a mouthful of ulcers. And my hair started falling out. So I'd wake up some mornings and there was just hair on my pillow. As the months went on, I started noticing other joints being affected. And before taking this drug, I only had arthritis in 4 joints, the knees and the ankles. Within 10 months of taking this drug, the arthritis had spread to every joint in my body. So from my jaw right down to my toes. So 2 years before that, I was auditioning for feature films. And now here I was, riddled with arthritis. I couldn't grip cutlery. I couldn't bend my elbows to bring food to my mouth. And I couldn't chew any food that was in my mouth because my jaw wasn't working. And being wheelchair bound, not being able to use my legs was the least of my worries because I couldn't even sit up straight because my hips were so swollen. And that's how it was for a while. And I had to make a decision of what I was going to do about the rest of my life. Went back to the rheumatologist. Mum wheeled me in a wheelchair, and I'm waiting for the big reaction. Lauren's in a wheelchair. She's never been in a wheelchair before. But there was no reaction. She barely bat an eyelid. And then she called me Laura. My name's Lauren. So firstly, I thought, she doesn't even know who I am. But also, this is normal for her. She is expecting this to happen. She doesn't know any different other than for things to progress this badly, for things to get this bad. It wasn't abnormal of her to see me wheeled in a wheelchair, even though for me and for my life, me personally, this had never happened before. And she proceeded to tell me that this drug works for 70% of people, and for 30% of people, it doesn't work for. And I had an epiphany at that point, after I got very angry and screamed and shouted, and Mum wheeled me out, and we vowed never to go back, and had an epiphany. That there must be more to how the body works than this. There must be more to why medications affect some people and don't affect other people than statistics, than 70% and 30%. I was 19, 18 going on 19, but something in me knew that there must be more to it than that. And I was going to find that out. So there I was, bedbound most days, when all my friends were off at uni, and I was supposed to be at uni, and some of my friends were traveling, and I couldn't even feed myself or take myself to the toilet. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because sometimes you have to hit that rock bottom place. You have to get that sick for you to want to do something to get better. So it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because everything changed after that. So I made a decision. At 19, in a wheelchair, with a damaged liver, by the way, because the drug absolutely annihilated my liver. It was barely working. With a damaged liver, half a head of hair, in bed, when all my friends were off living their best lives at 19, I made a decision that disability wasn't going to be my story. Wellness was. And I set out to make that happen. So in that journey, there were 4 things that I learned that umbrellaed everything else. Number 1, sometimes things have to get really bad for you to want to do something to make them better. Because I can tell you that if I hadn't have been that sick, I would still be living a life of mediocrity right now. Because I went through my life having arthritis. Sometimes it was okay, sometimes it wasn't. It was manageable. You can kind of get through life like that. It's not a great life, but you can get through life like that. Had I not have hit that rock bottom where I was literally as disabled as it gets, why would I have put that effort in to say that I was going to figure out a way to get myself better? Because I didn't want to be living in this no man's land of fine, of mediocrity. I knew that I could have a better life than that. So that was the first lesson. Sometimes things have to hit rock bottom, and sometimes that's the very best place you can be. Number 2, the modern healthcare system is actually a sick care system. Great at reacting, great at emergencies. Recently suffered an emergency myself last year. Without their services, I would probably be dead. So it's not that I'm not grateful for it, I am. But if you weigh up the amount of emergencies you have in 1 year, or in a whole lifetime, versus how ensconced you're going to get in that world if you have a chronic illness. If you have a chronic illness, you're getting lost in that system. No one's helping you. No one is going to fix you. It's a sick care system. There is no root cause healing. And I can tell you from my own experience, and experience now helping countless other people, that unless you hit it at the root cause, there is no healing. And the modern healthcare system as it is not set up to look at that. It's not set up to look at a whole person approach to healing. Which brings me to my next point, lesson number 3. I'd only get better if I healed all of me, not just part of me. Because the human being is not just a series of 100 parts all working in isolation. We're an entire being made up of a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual self. And we have to combine and create that as a whole. Holistic. Doesn't mean alternative, which is the misconception. It means whole. So a holistic approach to healing. I had to go back and fix all that emotional, mental, spiritual baggage. This wasn't about healing the body. This was about healing so much more than the body. And if I wanted to heal that part of me, I had to heal all of me. And number 4 was that no one else could do it for me. I could see the best homeopaths and herbalists and functional medicine doctors and the rest of it. And I did. I had some amazing practitioners and teachers and mentors and the rest of it. But essentially, it had to come from me. I had to make a decision that I was going to take responsibility for my own well-being. I had to stop outsourcing my health to other people. I had to want to get better. It had to come from me. So I went to Israel, where there was this doctor that we heard about who was practicing something called IPEC therapy, integrated physical emotional clearing, where he was combining 7 different types of integrative medicine into one. And I went out there with my mum, who literally wheeled me out there in a wheelchair. And he used kinesiology to ask the body what it needed and how best to proceed with his treatments. And he said, I'm going to ask your body 2 questions. I'm not even going to say them out loud because I don't want your conscious self to hear them and react. I'm going to just ask it through kinesiology. And the first question was, do you believe you can get better? And he said, well, great. Apparently you do believe you can get better, which is really rare for a child for a person who's had an illness their whole life, because you've never known life without illness. So actually, why would you even believe you could get better? You've never seen that. But my mum always sowed those seeds. So I'd be in my worst place and she'd go, but you're going to be okay. Like, you're going to get better. And I would go, what are you even talking about? Why would you even think that I could possibly get better? when I've never been better? You've never seen that, so why would you believe it? But she did believe it. Again, that niggle, that gut feeling that guided her in the first instance is what's been my savior this whole time. And so she obviously sowed that seed of belief in me that my subconscious believed I could get better. And the second question was, do you want to get better? So what do you mean? Who wouldn't want to get better? And then he explained about secondary gain. And it all started to make a lot of sense. So as the years went on, and I was trying all these different things and getting a bit better, I would take these discoveries and things that were working, things I felt that helped back to my hydrotherapy group, the same girls that, we'd grown up with in the hospital. And I'd say, this thing's really helping, or this seems to be something that's working. Why don't you try it? And they'd go, no, we're just going to listen to the doctors and, we're going to just do what we're doing. And I'm looking at them getting hoisted in to the hydrotherapy pool with an electric bed because they couldn't even get down the steps of the pool. And I'm like, come on, give it a go, try something. But when you've had an illness your whole life, it's really, really scary, the thought of being better. And you might not even realize this consciously because you think you want to get better, you think you want to live a normal life. But if you've never known life without an illness, and then all of a sudden you're better, you might have to go and socialize. And socializing is really scary if what has defined you your whole life is no longer there. Because then what's going to define you? What conversation might you have in that situation? And maybe you have to go and get a job. And maybe your whole life you've never had any jobs, you don't have a skill set, and if you're better, you've got to go and get that job because you've now got no excuse not to work. And that's really scary. So that was secondary gain. But he said to me, but you do want to get better. Again, really unusual, but he goes, I need to tell you, because you believe you can get better and you want to get better, you are halfway there. So he was kind of my initiation into this world of really kind of taking control. Obviously, we'd had the homeopathy, the spirituality that Mum had weaved into my life, my whole life. But this was really me taking responsibility and starting to learn about what holistic healing meant. And so I went away from him, and I immersed myself in intensive self-study to teach myself absolutely everything I could about what makes the human body and mind work and not work. So I studied everything from nutrition to fitness to hormones, because who had ever even spoken to me about my hormones? I got put on the pill at 14 because of heavy periods. And no one actually spoke to me about how that might affect me, how that might affect autoimmunity, how that might affect me later down the line. So I learned about hormones. I went deep down the rabbit hole about what actually happens in the pharmaceutical industry, and that was an education in itself, still is. I learned about emotional repression. I really delved into that idea of trauma and the trauma I'd been suffering with my whole life and never really understood, and how that was affecting me. I got to know who I was underneath all that trauma. Underneath the intense, the difficult, the highly strung, the one trying to fit in, who was I? I went on a journey and tried to find her. I started learning about the body's energy system and really immersed myself in the work of energy. I started trying to understand that. Trauma release. I worked on my self-worth and my pleasure, finding ways to have fun, to live in joy, because when we live in joy and we're experiencing pleasure, we're releasing nitric oxide. So not only do we experience that and benefit from that nitric oxide, but it's going out into the energy field around us. So we're serving humanity by being happy and being joyful. And I worked on my gratitude, even if I wasn't 100% well yet, and even if there were some really crappy days, I tried to be grateful and tried to understand the power of gratitude. I learned how to meditate. And I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it until I stopped telling myself this boring story of thoughts come to me. Anyone else? That's okay in meditation. Thoughts come to us. So I just kept doing it. And I started doing breath work, which was another integral piece of the puzzle, because what I didn't realize was that every time I was stressed and every time I was worried about illness or about pain, and every time I was in pain, my cortisol levels were shooting right up. And cortisol is a really dangerous hormone. And guess what? Cortisol affects the immune system. And there's an autoimmune disease going on here. So if I reduce my cortisol, then maybe that's another link, and another link, and another link. And there were all these links that I had to fit together. So breath work brings us down from that heightened beta brainwave state into that alpha state, where cortisol levels drop, adrenaline drops, dopamine increases a bit, feel a bit happier. We energize the cells in our bodies. You just operate much more optimally. I deepened my spiritual practice, which had kind of begun when I was a child anyway. And when I was really in my worst days, before I'd gone to Israel and started this journey, my mum's friend brought me a tape, literally a cassette tape, of Brandon Bay's meditation called the Healing Sands Meditation. I was 18 at the time. It was 20 years ago, and I still listen to that meditation today because it just does something for me. And I did the Brandon Bay's The Journey. And I deepened my spiritual practice in the understanding that my spiritual self was part of myself, and I'm connected to absolutely everything, and I'm connected to source, and without that source energy, I cannot function. I learned about what caused toxicities. I learned about toxic load, which led me to understanding more about what I put in and on my body and how that would affect me. Everything I'm consuming or breathing or putting on myself would affect the toxic load of my body and could impact how the illness is presenting. So I started reducing my exposure to toxicity through everything from food to the products I put on myself to synthetic fragrances I was breathing in, absolutely everything. And leading on from that, with toxicity, that also included removing toxic people from my life, because that energy needed to change as well. I stopped focusing on autoimmune diet or anti-inflammatory diet, because you know what that was doing? That was putting me into a state of victim consciousness. Because when I'm focusing on the dis-ease, I'm not focusing on the healing. So when I'm focusing on, I need an autoimmune diet because I've got an autoimmune disease, I'm putting myself into that victim consciousness of this is what defines me, which is why you'll never hear me say my arthritis. And for anyone here who's suffering from any chronic illness, it's never my arthritis, my cancer, my diabetes, my whatever it is. Because once it's yours, it defines you and it owns you. And it doesn't define you. And it doesn't need to own you. Because you're a powerful being. And you can change that with your daily actions. So I stopped all of that. I stopped anything that was associated with having arthritis. Because I was in a state of healing. And that was the key. And later on came neuroplasticity, understanding about how to rewire the neural pathways in the brain, because for my whole life, I had this limiting belief of I can't get better because how could I get better if I've never known how to get better? And obviously, apparently through kinesiology, my subconscious, my higher self did believe I could get better. But I always had this feeling of, is it really going to happen? And then I discovered neuroplasticity, and I learned that we can rewire these neural pathways in the brain. We can break down old thoughts and old limiting beliefs that tell us something that doesn't need to be true. We can rewrite our lives through the brain. There's so little we understand about the brain, but we do know this. We do know that it's like plasticine. It's a software. We're not hardwired. So we download all this conditioning from around us from childhood, and that becomes our reality. But we can absolutely rewrite that by the ways we talk to ourselves. And then leading on from that, I discovered epigenetics. And epigenetics was really the last piece, that missing piece to the puzzle. Because I learned that your genes are not your destiny. And when I was put on that drug, And it affected me really badly, and it doesn't affect everyone like that. And I kept saying, there must be more to this. It turns out there was more to this, to why it affected me so badly. So I have a gene polymorphism called MTHFR, which some of you might have heard of. I've actually written about it in What Doctors Don't Tell You, so I'm sure that article's out there somewhere. And learning about that, learning that my body essentially couldn't process toxins effectively. And it couldn't process certain vitamins, especially B vitamins like folic acid and B12, and here I was being put on synthetic folic acid. So now it all made sense why my body couldn't manage to detox and why I experienced that toxic overload when I did. So epigenetics was really this last key piece, understanding my genes, having genes testing and understanding what was going on in my genetic makeup that I could now understand and use to my advantage. It didn't need to be a death sentence. Okay, so you have a genetic predisposition to prostate cancer. You have a genetic predisposition to the BRCA gene. We now know that our genes are not our destiny. Epigenetics is how our lifestyle affects the makeup of our genes, and whether or not what you are genetically predisposed to will get triggered. That gene can remain switched off. And this was mind-blowing for me. And so I was immersed in the work of healing the whole self, and it wasn't smooth at all. It went very much like that, and it would get a bit better, and then it would go down a bit, and it would get a bit better, and I'd think, oh, it's happening, and then I'd start living a normal life, and then it would go down a bit, and Mum was always there telling me they would get better, and over time, it did start getting better. And 10 years after I made that decision, age 19, at the age of 29, I went into remission. And I'm now nearly a decade on from that, still doing really well. And so I guess if you came here looking for a magic answer of how to cure chronic disease, there's no one size fits all, there's no magic answer. And that is the key thing to understand here. It has to be a whole person approach. But if you immerse yourself in the mentality of healing and remove that mentality of dis-ease, and you optimize your health and optimize your life in every way you can, you create the energetic environment for healing to happen. So thank you.